I will never speak to my dad or stepmom again once I turn 18. Growing up, I thought I had a pretty regular family. My mom and dad weren't overly affectionate or anything, but they seemed solid. My mom took care of the house, and my dad was the typical provider, as he liked to call himself. Life was good enough, you know? Nothing too flashy, but we got by, and I had my mom around all the time, so I didn't think much of my dad's weird work hours. He'd be home late and leave early, but hey, I just figured that's how work was for adults. Kids don't question stuff like that. Everything flipped when I turned 7. That was the year my dad's Secret came out, and I still remember how it felt like getting hit by a bus. I came home from school one day, and the tension in the house was so thick you could practically see it hanging in the air. My mom wasn't herself at all. She looked pale and almost frozen, like she was just going through the motions. I asked if everything was okay, but she brushed me off, telling me to go to my room. I didn't know it then, but this was the start of my life unraveling. Turns out, my dad had been cheating on my mom. And this wasn't some fling or anything. He'd been seeing this other woman for years. Worse, they'd had a kid together, a kid that I would eventually be forced to live with. But let me not jump too far ahead. My mom tried to leave with me as soon as she found out. She didn't want anything to do with my dad or his mess. She started packing our stuff, grabbing anything we could fit in bags. I remember watching her shove clothes and random stuff into suitcases, her hands shaking the whole time. At that point, I didn't fully get what was going on, but seeing her so panicked freaked me out. Just as she's practically dragging me out the door, my dad shows up. And he wasn't alone. He brought this other woman with him, the mistress. She had this smug look on her face, like she'd won some prize or something. My mom told him to get lost and let us leave, but he wasn't having it. I remember him telling her, real calm-like, that if she tried to take me, he'd make sure she got deported. This might be where I should explain something. My mom's an immigrant, and her visa situation was, well, let's just say it was messy. She'd overstayed by years at that point. They were only married through the church, not legally in the States. I didn't know any of that until my dad threw it in her face. He told her he'd call immigration himself if she tried to leave with me. It was a low blow, even for him, but my mom had no choice. She couldn't risk being deported and leaving me behind with him. She was trapped, just like I was about to be. I'll never forget the way she looked at me when she finally realized she was stuck. It was like her heart broke right there. She tried to tell me everything was going to be okay, but I could see in her eyes she didn't believe it. I don't think I did either. But what could I do? I was just a kid, caught in the middle of this mess they'd made. After that, my dad took me to live with him and his mistress. It was like I'd been dropped into some twisted version of my old life. Suddenly, I wasn't in my own home anymore, and everything around me felt strange and wrong. The mistress, I'll just call her M to keep things simple, made it pretty clear from day one that I wasn't there to be a part of their family. Nope, I was just a convenient extra set of hands, a helper for her and her son. Her son, my half-brother, had Down syndrome, and while I understood he needed extra help, it was pretty obvious they wanted me to be the one doing a lot of it. The first few days were just a blur of orders. Help him with this. Make sure he eats. Don't let him wander off. I'd come home from school and be expected to take over his care while they did, well, who knows what. I was just a kid too, but suddenly I was supposed to be some kind of babysitter or caregiver. Anytime I brought up my own needs, like wanting to play with friends or needing time for myself, I'd get the same lecture. Family comes first. You need to step up. You're the big sister now. Act like it. They basically wanted me to treat him like he was my responsibility, even though I was barely older than him and honestly had no idea how to handle all this. My dad's attitude was the worst part. This guy who was supposed to be my father, my protector, just turned into this stranger who saw me as nothing more than a tool. He'd watch me struggle and shrug it off, saying it was good for me to help out. Meanwhile, anything I had in my old life, the little hobbies, my toys, whatever, was left behind. If I ever mentioned my mom, he'd get this look and tell me to focus on the family here. It was like he wanted to erase her from my memory entirely, make it so I had no connection to her or my old life. I tried to keep some normalcy, but it felt impossible. Even things like school projects or wanting to play sports got shut down because there's work to be done here. It was suffocating, and no one around me seemed to care. I'd watch other kids at school with their parents, and all I could feel was this weird mix of jealousy and anger. How did I get stuck with a dad who saw me as nothing more than an unpaid worker? Why did I have to lose my mom just because he screwed up? And M? She acted like she was doing me some big favor by letting me live with them. She'd go on about how I was lucky to have a roof over my head, as if my whole existence depended on her charity. It didn't matter that my dad was the one who forced this whole mess on us. She treated me like some unwanted guest in my own father's house. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Em was complaining about me, saying I wasn't helpful enough and needed to pull my weight. My dad just nodded along, agreeing with her like he didn't even remember I was his own kid. Hearing them talk about me like that, like I was just some burden, hit me harder than I thought it would. I'd always thought deep down that maybe my dad would see me as his daughter first, no matter what. But that night, I realized I was just another obligation to him. Looking back, that's probably the moment I started resenting him. He wasn't just my dad who made a mistake. He was this person who took my life, ripped it apart, and didn't care one bit about the pieces he left behind. And I was trapped there, powerless to change any of it, just waiting for some kind of miracle that never came. Em was all about making sure her son was the focus, and my dad went right along with it. I was supposed to be grateful to live with them, even though I felt more like the hired help than a daughter. Every day was the same routine. I'd get up, help with my brother, then head to school, and the second I got home, it was back to family duties. And by family duties, I mean I was expected to help him with everything: feeding him, playing with him, even dealing with his tantrums if he got frustrated. It was like I was supposed to be his emotional punching bag, too. The worst part was that nothing I did ever seemed good enough for Em. She'd hover over my shoulder, criticizing every little thing. If I fed him too slowly, she'd complain that he was going to get upset. If I didn't respond to him fast enough, she'd snap at me to pay attention. There were days I wanted to scream because no matter how hard I tried, she'd find something wrong. And let's be real, this woman had no problem telling me exactly how she felt. "You need to be more responsible," she'd say, as if I'd asked for any of this. Then there was my dad, who, honestly, was like a ghost in the house. He'd be around, but he'd check out whenever things got tough. If Em and I were dealing with a meltdown from my brother, he'd just leave the room, like it was someone else's problem. I don't know what I expected from him, but it definitely wasn't this. It was like he decided his new family was more important, and I was just there, an extra. I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked me how my day was or if I needed help with my schoolwork. That just wasn't a priority. Even things like buying me clothes or school supplies felt like a burden to them. Em would talk about how expensive it was to care for my brother and how everyone in the family had to make sacrifices for his sake. By everyone, she meant me. Her sacrifices usually involved sitting on the couch while I ran around, doing everything she didn't feel like doing. Eventually, I just started going numb to it. Every day felt like survival mode. I'd go through the motions, just trying to make it to the end of each day without getting yelled at. I'd put my head down, keep quiet, and hope they'd leave me alone if I stayed under the radar. Sometimes it worked, but most of the time, they found something to blame me for. One day, though, things hit a whole new low. Em was in one of her moods, complaining about how I wasn't helpful enough and that I should be more invested in my brother's care. I remember thinking, are you serious? I was just a kid too. I hadn't signed up for this life. But trying to argue or stand up for myself, total waste of time. If I dared say anything, I'd get shut down immediately. And this woman had no problem making me feel like dirt if she thought it'd make me more obedient. She'd say things like, "If you can't handle this, maybe you should go live somewhere else," knowing full well I had nowhere else to go. She dangled that over me, reminding me constantly that they were giving me a home. My dad, as usual, would just sit there silently, letting her run the show. I don't know if he thought she was right or if he just didn't care, but either way, he never once had my back. Then there was school, which was basically the only escape I had left. But even that got screwed up because they started expecting me to bring him to his appointments or help with his special programs. Any extra time I had was slowly chipped away by these responsibilities. I'd watch other kids in my class hanging out, doing clubs or sports, and feel this gnawing jealousy. My life was so different from theirs. I'd come home exhausted just to get thrown back into caregiver mode. And anytime I tried to say I was struggling, Em would roll her eyes, saying I was overdramatic. She'd go on about how hard it was to take care of my brother, how we all had to pull together to make it work. But honestly, there was no we. It was just me. She sat back while I did the dirty work, acting like she was the martyr for keeping this family together. I'll never forget one night when it all just boiled over. I'd had a rough day at school, didn't sleep well the night before, and I was just done. My brother had a rough day too and was acting up more than usual. By the time dinner came around, I was running on fumes. I must have been moving too slowly for Em's taste because she snapped at me, telling me I was useless if I couldn't handle this simple job. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "If it's so simple, why don't you do it?" For a second, I thought I'd won. She just stood there, speechless. But then her face twisted in this rage and she practically screamed at me, saying if I didn't like living with them, I should get out. My dad was sitting there, eating his food like nothing was happening. I looked at him, hoping he'd step in, maybe say something to defend me. Instead, he just sighed, like I was some annoyance he had to tolerate. It hit me in that moment. He wasn't ever going to take my side. Not against her, not for anything. I was completely alone in that house. After that, I just stopped trying to fight back. It wasn't worth the stress, and honestly, I didn't have it in me anymore. I'd go through the motions, do what they asked, and avoid drawing attention. That numbness I'd been feeling, it was turning into something darker. Anger, resentment, maybe even hate. But I kept it all bottled up, knowing that any sign of resistance would only make things worse. I started thinking that maybe this was just my life now, trapped in a house where I didn't belong, stuck in a role I never wanted, with no way out. Every day was the same thing. School, come home, do chores, take care of my brother, get yelled at, go to bed, and do it all over again the next day. But deep down, there was this tiny part of me that held on to a sliver of hope. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I was determined that one day, I'd get out of there. It was the only thing that kept me going, even on the worst days. By the time I hit my teens, I'd learned a few survival tricks. One of the biggest ones was staying under the radar. If I kept quiet and did whatever M told me to do, they'd mostly leave me alone. But mostly wasn't enough. The older I got, the more they tried to rope me into helping with my brother's appointments, his therapy, and anything else that took up my time. At this point, I barely had a life outside of them, which I guess was exactly what they wanted. But I still had a bit of a rebellious streak, and I wasn't about to let them control everything. Around the time I turned 15, I managed to get a part-time job at a local store after school. My dad and Em were all too happy to let me work because they figured it meant extra money for the family. But what they didn't know was that this job was my way out. It gave me freedom, and more importantly, a little cash I could hide away. I figured that one day I'd need it. I told them my shifts were longer than they actually were, which bought me some extra time. And what did I do with that time? I started sneaking off to see my mom. After years of almost no contact, she'd finally settled down in a place not too far from us. She was renting a tiny apartment with just the basics, but to me, it was like paradise. Just being able to sit and talk to her felt like finding a part of myself I'd forgotten. She was still trying to get back on her feet, working whatever job she could get. I could tell things weren't easy for her, but she'd put on a brave face whenever I came around. My dad and Em didn't know about the visits, of course. If they had, they would have put an end to them fast. I'd usually just tell them I was staying late at work, which seemed to work since they liked the idea of me learning responsibility. I'd go to my job, finish up, and then head over to my mom's. We'd sit on her lumpy couch, eating whatever she had in the fridge, and just talk. Sometimes she'd tell me stories from when she was young, about her life before all this mess. Those were some of the only moments I felt like a real kid again. Seeing my mom like that, struggling, but free, was a reminder of what I wanted for myself. She always told me to keep my head up and hang in there. She'd say, "One day we'll get out of this." And even though I didn't fully believe it, hearing her say it helped me keep going. Those visits kept me sane. But good things never lasted long in my world. I guess I was being too obvious, or maybe someone saw us together. One day, my mom didn't answer the door. I knocked, called out for her, but there was no answer. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to assume the worst, but something told me it was bad. It didn't take long to find out. Later that night, Em overheard me on the phone, trying to get in touch with my mom. She asked why I'd been acting secretive and wanted to know what I was hiding. I tried to brush her off, but she kept pushing. Finally, I cracked and told her I'd been visiting my mom. She looked shocked, then furious. And I knew I'd messed up. The next day, my dad sat me down. He didn't even yell, which somehow made it worse. He looked disappointed, like I'd betrayed him or something. I'll never forget what he said. "You're just going to make life harder for her if you keep doing this." That was all he had to say. No apology, no compassion. Just a reminder that my actions were somehow making things worse for my mom. I felt like he was blaming me for her situation, which was ridiculous because he'd put her in that spot to begin with. A week later, I got the news. My mom had been deported. Just like that, she was gone, sent back to a place she hadn't lived in for years. I was devastated. She was the only real family I had left, and now she was out of reach. My dad and Em didn't even seem fazed by it. Em just shrugged and said something like, At least now you won't have to sneak around anymore. They acted like she was some stranger, like she hadn't been a part of my life. It was infuriating. That day changed something in me. I think that was the moment I really stopped caring about what my dad or Em thought of me. They'd taken away the one person who actually cared about me. And for what? To keep their little family image intact? It made me realize just how messed up they were, and that if I was ever going to be free, I'd have to play by my own rules. Without my mom around, I didn't know what to do. I spent days feeling lost, just going through the motions. But then, something clicked. I couldn't let them win. They'd already taken so much from me, and I wasn't about to let them keep me trapped forever. I started going back to work, taking on more shifts, saving up even more. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew that when the time came, I'd be ready. After my mom got deported, I tried to stay invisible. I kept my head down, did what was expected, and avoided anything that would get Em or my dad's attention. Every day felt like I was walking on eggshells, and any wrong move could bring on one of Em's moods, which could mean hours of snide comments and extra work dumped on me. But under all that, I was planning. I knew if I wanted out, I'd have to play my cards just right. Then, out of nowhere, my mom's friend showed up. Let's call her Lisa. She was one of the few people who hadn't cut my mom off after everything went down. Lisa was a real friend, the kind who stuck around even when things got hard. She somehow found out about my situation and reached out to me. One day, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Hi, this is Lisa, your mom's friend. I want to help." I stared at it, not sure if it was even real. After everything I'd been through, it felt too good to be true. But it was real, and Lisa turned out to be my lifeline. We met in secret whenever I could get away. She'd pick a quiet spot where no one would recognize me, usually some little cafe or an empty park. We'd talk about everything, what my mom had been like after she was deported, how much she missed me, and how she was trying to get her life back together. Hearing that my mom was okay, or at least surviving, gave me a sliver of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Lisa didn't have a ton of money, but she'd slip me whatever she could spare. She told me to hide it, and believe me, I did. I'd stash the cash in random places in my room where I knew Em would never look. She was too busy making sure I stayed in line to notice. The money wasn't much, but it added up over time. I didn't have a clear plan, but knowing I had some backup made a huge difference. It felt like, for the first time, I had a bit of control over my life. One day, Lisa gave me something even more valuable than money. A cheap old phone. It wasn't anything fancy, just some outdated model she'd found. But it worked. She told me my mom had managed to get a phone number and that I could call her if I needed to. The first time I dialed the number, my hands were shaking. I hadn't heard my mom's voice in so long that I was terrified I'd forget what she sounded like. When she picked up, I could barely get any words out. She was crying, and I was just standing there trying to keep myself together. We didn't say much that first call, but it was enough to know she was there. We talked whenever I could sneak away. Hearing her voice, even through a cheap phone, felt like having a piece of my old life back. Lisa helped me with more than just money and a phone. She also gave me advice. She'd tell me not to let my dad or Em see any cracks, to keep up the act until I was old enough to leave for good. She'd say things like, "Don't let them know they're getting to you." I'd nod along, trying to follow her advice, but it wasn't easy. Living with those two, it felt like every time I got comfortable, they'd find a way to mess things up again. One night, Em found a small stash of cash I'd hidden under my bed. She flipped, accusing me of stealing from the family. I tried to explain that I'd saved it for my job, but she didn't want to hear it. She dragged my dad into it, and they both sat me down, acting like I'd committed some massive betrayal. My dad gave me this disappointed look, and Em just kept ranting about ungrateful kids and how I was lucky to have a roof over my head. I didn't say a word. I just let them go on, acting like I was sorry. But in my head, I was fuming. I knew right then that I'd have to be even more careful from then on. After that, I got smarter. I started hiding money outside the house, in places only I knew. Sometimes I'd give it to Lisa to hold on to for me, just in case. She always told me to keep enough cash to get by if things got bad. Her support was like this invisible safety net I could count on, even when everything else felt shaky. By the time I turned 17, I was practically living two lives. At home, I was this obedient, quiet kid who never caused trouble. But outside, whenever I had time with Lisa or talked to my mom, I felt like myself. I didn't have to pretend. I could laugh, cry, vent about Em, or talk about the future without worrying someone would jump down my throat. That little glimpse of freedom was what kept me going. Lisa knew I was getting close to 18, and she started talking to me about what I wanted to do next. My dad and Em expected me to stick around, probably forever, to help with my brother. They had this idea that I'd just stay, like I was a permanent part of their messed up system. But Lisa reminded me that I had options, even if they weren't perfect. One day, Lisa sat me down and asked, "Have you thought about college or anything you want to do after you turn 18?" She was serious, not just making conversation. I hadn't thought about college much because it seemed impossible. With no support from my dad and barely any money, I figured it was a dream out of reach. But she didn't let it go. She encouraged me to look into scholarships, saying I deserved a real chance. I didn't know it then, but Lisa had actually started talking to my mom about finding a scholarship for me. She didn't tell me right away, probably because she didn't want to get my hopes up. But knowing she was in my corner like that, it meant more than I could put into words. I spent that last year just getting by, holding onto the money I'd saved, and keeping my plans a secret. The days blurred together, with my only focus being survival until I hit that magical age when I could leave without their permission. Every time Em would nag or my dad would ignore me, I'd just tell myself, only a little longer. It was my mantra, the thing that kept me from snapping. By the time my 18th birthday was in sight, I was ready. The money I'd saved wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to leave, enough to start over, enough to finally take control of my own life. Lisa and my mom had given me everything they could, and now it was up to me. The countdown was on, and every day that passed, I got one step closer to freedom. I could practically taste it. When I turned 18, I knew my life was about to change. I'd been waiting for this day for so long, planning, saving, counting down every single day until I could finally leave my dad's house without having to ask anyone's permission. The night before, I barely slept. I kept going over my plan, making sure I had everything I needed, everything I'd been hiding for so long. I'd never been this nervous, but at the same time, I felt this strange calm. I knew that by the end of the day, I'd be free. My dad and Em didn't suspect anything. They thought I'd be around forever, always ready to help with my brother and handle whatever they threw at me. I hadn't told them about any of my plans. Why would I? All they'd done over the years was ignore or belittle me, make me feel like I owed them my time, my energy, my entire life. But they didn't own me, and today I was finally going to prove it. That morning, I packed up everything I'd been stashing away. Lisa had given me a small duffel bag, and it was stuffed with clothes, cash, and anything important I'd managed to keep. I looked around my room for the last time. This place that had felt more like a prison cell than a bedroom. I didn't feel sad or nostalgic. All I felt was relief, like I was finally peeling off a heavy layer that had been holding me down for years. My dad was at work, and Em was preoccupied with my brother, as usual. It was a perfect setup. I didn't want any drama, no big goodbye, just a quiet exit that would leave them wondering. I left a note on the kitchen counter, short and to the point. It just said, "I'm leaving. I'm not coming back." Simple as that. They didn't deserve anything more. I walked out the door, and for the first time, I felt light. No one was watching me. No one was telling me what to do. No one was pulling me back. I didn't have to look over my shoulder or think about getting home on time. I was finally in control, and it felt like the best thing in the world. I walked down the street with my duffel bag, not looking back once. Lisa was waiting for me a few blocks away, just like we'd planned. She had her car parked by the side of the road, and the second I got in, she gave me this huge grin. "You did it," she said. And honestly, hearing those words made everything hit me at once. I'd really done it. I was out. I couldn't hold back anymore. I just started laughing, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't had in years. We drove for a bit, just talking and catching up. Lisa was like this supportive, safe presence in my life, the one person who'd been there through everything. She didn't ask if I was okay, didn't try to dig for details. She just let me enjoy the moment, finally free from all the baggage. It felt amazing, like I was shedding a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying for so long. But that wasn't even the best part. After a while, Lisa pulled out an envelope from her bag and handed it to me. "This is from your mom," she said. My heart just about stopped. I hadn't seen my mom in person since she was deported, and though we'd talked a few times, I hadn't dared to hope she'd be involved in my escape. But here was this envelope, with my name written in her familiar handwriting. Inside, there was a plane ticket to my mom's country. I just stared at it, speechless, my brain trying to catch up with what was happening. I looked at Lisa, completely stunned. She smiled and nodded as if reading my mind. "Your mom's been working on this for a long time. She found a scholarship for you at a college near her place. It's all set up. You're going to see her." I couldn't believe it. It was like a dream, and I half expected to wake up back in that miserable room at my dad's house. But this was real. My mom had pulled off something incredible, something I'd never even thought possible. She'd found a way to give me a new start, far from everything that had weighed me down for years. I was going to see her, live with her, have a chance at a normal life. Lisa drove me to the airport, and I spent that entire ride in a haze. I kept looking at the ticket, double-checking the date, the time, like it would disappear if I stopped looking at it. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's story. But it was mine. Finally, something good was happening to me. At the airport, Lisa hugged me tightly. "Take care of yourself," she said. I promised I would. She had been there for me like no one else, and I'd never be able to repay her for all she'd done. She waved as I went through security, and I waved back, knowing I owed her so much. I'd miss her, but this was the beginning of something better. The flight was long, and I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my mind, like I had to hold on to each memory to make sure it stayed real. I pictured my mom's face, imagined what it would be like to finally see her again, to sit in a room with her without fear or guilt, or the weight of my dad's control. I tried not to get too emotional, but it was impossible. For once, I had something to look forward to, a future that wasn't mapped out by someone else. When the plane landed, my heart was pounding. I went through customs, got my bag, and walked out into the arrivals area. And there she was, waiting for me, my mom. She looked older, more tired than I remembered, but she was there, her eyes filled with tears, a smile breaking through. I ran to her, and she hugged me tighter than I'd ever been hugged in my life. We didn't say much, just held on to each other. It was like everything I'd been through melted away in that moment. I was finally home. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that with her by my side, I could handle whatever came my way. The years of feeling trapped, the loneliness, the anger, it all started to fade. I was free, and I was with my mom, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. As we drove to her place, she told me more about the college, the scholarship, the life she'd been working to build for us. I listened, feeling a mix of excitement and relief. This was my new start, a chance to be someone other than the kid who had to take care of everyone else. I'd finally have a chance to be me, without anyone controlling my life. Looking back, I don't regret any of it. Not the waiting, not the hiding, not even the fights with Em and my dad. It made me stronger, more determined to find my own path. And now, with my mom by my side, I knew I'd finally get to live the life I'd been dreaming of for years. Last update. You guys won't believe what just happened. Let me break it down for you. A few months after I'd finally settled in with my mom, I got some news from back home. It was like a weird, twisted epilogue to the nightmare I'd left behind. I didn't expect to hear from anyone back there, but one day I got a message from our old neighbor, Mrs. Perez. I'd completely forgotten about her in the chaos of leaving, but she'd been one of the few decent people around back when I was living with my dad and Em. She'd sometimes slip me food when I was left to fend for myself, or give me small things I needed, always with this soft smile that said, "Hang in there." She never had much, but she tried to help however she could. Seeing her message was surprising, to say the least. I hadn't thought she'd reach out, but she'd heard through the grapevine that I'd left and wanted to check in, see how I was doing. When I told her I'd moved in with my mom and was finally free, she was thrilled. She even sent this little heart emoji, which felt strangely sweet coming from her. But the real surprise came when she told me what was going on back at my dad's house. Turns out, things had gone downhill fast after I left. My dad and Em were in the middle of a nasty divorce. I nearly dropped my phone when I read that part. Divorce? The two of them had always seemed like some unbreakable, miserable team. I'd always thought they'd spend their whole lives together, tormenting each other and everyone around them, but apparently, the cracks had started showing pretty much as soon as I was out of the picture. Mrs. Perez told me it was like Em had snapped when I left. She'd been getting more demanding, lashing out at my dad over everything, especially about my half-brother's care. I guess all the responsibility I used to shoulder got dumped squarely on them, and neither of them could handle it. The whole setup fell apart without me there to keep it stitched together. It's darkly funny when I think about it, how they'd put everything on me for years, acting like I was worthless, and now that I was gone, they were crumbling. But that wasn't even the wildest part. Mrs. Perez dropped a bomb on me. My brother wasn't even my dad's son. My first reaction was just shock. I'd spent years taking care of that kid, being told he was my half-brother, that we were family. And all along, it had been a lie. Mrs. Perez explained that there had been some kind of medical issue, something serious that required knowing family history. And that's when things started unraveling. My dad had gone through DNA testing, thinking it would help find the cause. And instead, he found out he wasn't related to my brother at all. Apparently, my dad was furious. He felt like he'd been tricked, like M had somehow conned him into this entire life that wasn't even his. Honestly, I almost laughed when Mrs. Perez told me. It felt like some kind of twisted justice. All those years he'd spent lording over me, making me feel small and using me to help with M's son, and now he found out that kid wasn't even his. I couldn't think of a better ending to their little perfect family charade. Mrs. Perez said that after the test results came out, my dad packed his bags and left. He didn't want anything to do with M or her son anymore. He'd completely abandoned them. She told me that M was in shambles, crying to anyone who'd listen about how unfair it all was. I'll admit, part of me wanted to go back there just to see the look on her face. All those years, she treated me like garbage, like I owed her my entire life, and now she was the one left alone, dealing with everything on her own. Hearing about my dad's reaction felt complicated. I'll be honest, I hated him for a long time. He'd treated me like I was nothing, all for the sake of a kid he didn't even know was his. Part of me felt like he deserved everything he was going through, every bit of betrayal and anger. But another part of me felt a strange sort of pity for him. He'd built his life around a lie, around someone else's child, and now he was realizing just how empty it all was. Mrs. Perez asked if I wanted her to pass along a message to him, if I wanted to talk to him about what happened. But I didn't. I didn't see the point. He'd made his choice a long time ago when he decided that I wasn't his priority. I wanted him to sit with that, to live with the mess he'd created without dragging me back into it. He'd put me through so much for so long that it felt almost fitting for him to experience some of the fallout on his own. In a way, it felt like closure. Knowing he'd finally faced some consequences, that he was feeling even a fraction of the betrayal I'd felt, was oddly satisfying. I didn't need to go back, didn't need to see it for myself. Just hearing it was enough. He was living his own nightmare now, and I was free from it. I thanked Mrs. Perez for telling me. I let her know I was doing well, and that she didn't need to worry about me anymore. She wished me luck and told me she'd be around if I ever needed anything. That was the last time we spoke, but knowing she was still there, still rooting for me, meant a lot. So, that's where it all ended. My dad got what he deserved. Em was left to deal with her own mess, and I was miles away, finally building a life I wanted. It wasn't some fairy tale ending or anything like that, but it was real. It was justice, in its own messed up way, and for once I felt like I was free from all of it, ready to start a life that was actually mine.